This is what you deserve, you useless old woman. From now on, you're on your own. Those were the last words my son, David Hale, hurled at me as he slammed the car door and sped away. I stood frozen in front of a collapsing house deep in the woods, its walls cracked and its roof sagging as if it was about to give in at any second. Dust from his tires clouded the air while my heart pounded with disbelief. I watched his silhouette vanish in the rearview mirror, and all I could see was contempt. To him, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was nothing but dead weight, something to be dumped out of sight so he could move forward without shame. That moment cut deeper than any insult. 3 days later, the silence shattered. My old phone lit up again and again, once, twice, 10 times, then 20. By the end of that day, David had called me 45 times in a frenzy, his voice desperate, nearly broken. "Mum, what did you do? Please answer me." But by then, regret no longer mattered. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 74 years old, and the story I want to share with you is not just about betrayal. It is about how a mother, after being cast aside by her own child, can still find the strength to reclaim dignity and draw the line between love and survival. It's also a reminder that life has a way of putting everyone back in their place, often when they least expect it. I know some of you watching may carry scars of your own, maybe not from your children, but perhaps from a friend, a sibling, or even a spouse who turned their back when you needed them most. My hope is that as you listen, you'll not only see my journey, but you'll find courage to face your own. So stay with me, because this isn't just about a mother abandoned in the woods. It's about justice, resilience, and the moment life turns tables in ways no one can predict. I was born in a small farm town in the Midwest, the kind of place where the sky felt endless, and the days were measured not by the clock, but by chores in the fields. My father, a farmer, taught me that a person's worth is found in their word and the sweat on their brow. My mother, a seamstress, stitched our clothes late into the night, with tired eyes but steady hands. They didn't have much, but what they gave us was priceless integrity, discipline, and a belief that even small lives could hold dignity. By the time I was 10, I could guide a plough straighter than most grown men. Dirt under my nails, calluses on my palms, and the stubborn sun on my back became part of who I was. There weren't luxuries in our home, but there were principles, and those principles were carried like treasures that no one could take away. As I grew older, sewing became my craft, just as it had been my mother's. I spent 35 years in a small room with a single humming machine, bent over fabric until my fingers were marked by tiny scars. Every prom dress, school uniform, or curtain I stitched wasn't just fabric. It was a way of putting food on our table, of making sure my family never went without. I would work until the lamp flickered, and sometimes the steady thrum of the machine was the last thing I heard before falling asleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honorable. Through those long nights, I wasn't alone. My husband, Thomas Hale, was the steady anchor of my life. He had the kind of strength that didn't shout, but reassured, the kind that let me push forward because I knew someone was waiting with open arms. When I finally left my sewing room after hours of work, he would hold me, kiss my forehead, and remind me that every sacrifice was worth it. Together we raised 3 children, David, Michael, and Anna. Our house was modest, often filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Michael and Anna would run into my arms when I came out of the sewing room, their joy dissolving every ounce of exhaustion. Even though we lived paycheck to paycheck, I considered myself rich because we had unity and love. But looking back, I realized there were early signs that not every child would carry those same values. While Michael and Anna embraced our way of life with warmth, David stood apart. Even as a boy, his eyes held calculation more than innocence. He spoke of big dreams, of not wanting to be known as the son of a labourer. At the time, I mistook his words for ambition, something every parent wishes to see in their child. What I didn't realise was that behind those dreams was a seed of pride that would one day grow into something much darker. Still in those years, I believed our family was unshakable. I believed that with Thomas by my side and the children around our table, nothing could break us. And that belief carried me through decades of quiet sacrifice, through every needle prick and weary morning, through every hug that made it all worth it. As the children grew, their personalities became clearer. Michael and Anna carried the warmth of home wherever they went. They were quick to smile, eager to help, and their affection for me never wavered. When I came home tired, covered in threads, and smelling of fabric dust, they would run into my arms without hesitation. To them, I wasn't just their mother. I was their safe place. David, though, was different. Even as a boy, there was a sharpness in him that set him apart from his siblings. At 12, he already spoke with a tone that made me feel more like an employee than a mother. He would tell me he didn't want to end up like us people with dirty hands and simple clothes. He dreamed of power money and recognition. At first, I thought that was a good thing. What parent doesn't want to see their child aim higher, break out of the cycle and achieve more? But what unsettled me was not the dream itself. It was the way he looked at me when he said it, as if my hands rough from years of sewing were something to be ashamed of. When David turned 18, I found him a job as an office assistant. It was an honest start, the kind of opportunity many in our town would have been grateful for. But he sneered at it. He complained every day that it was beneath him that someone with his potential deserved more. Eventually, he studied construction management and found his way into a better career. On paper, it looked like success. In reality, it was the beginning of the distance that grew between us. I still remember the evenings when I'd come home late, my clothes carrying the faint scent of machine oil from long hours at the sewing table. David, already working in the city and dressed in crisp shirts, would wrinkle his nose and say in front of everyone at the dinner table, "Mum, couldn't you at least shower before sitting down? That smell is embarrassing." Those words hit me harder than he knew, not because I felt dirty or ashamed, but because my own son had chosen to humiliate me in front of his siblings and his father. My husband Thomas would give me a look, a silent plea not to argue, and I would quietly excuse myself to the bathroom. I told myself he was young, that he didn't understand yet what real effort meant. I convinced myself that one day maturity would teach him respect. But as the years passed, his disdain only deepened. While Michael and Anna still greeted me with gratitude, David became colder, more critical. He measured everything through money, status, and appearances. The values I had lived by: dignity, sacrifice, family, seemed invisible to him. It's a painful thing when strangers treat you poorly, but there is a unique sting when it comes from your own child. I carried that hurt quietly, refusing to let it break the family harmony. I bit back my words, swallowed my pride, and hoped that the son who once played at my feet would someday remember where he came from. Life carried on with its steady rhythm, until one day it didn't. Thomas, my partner of more than 45 years, began to feel unwell. At first it was small things, fatigue he couldn't explain, aches that lingered too long, food that suddenly had no taste. We thought it was age or stress, the kind of wear and tear that comes with time. But deep down, I sensed something was wrong. I still remember the day the doctor looked me in the eye and said the words no spouse ever wants to hear: pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. My heart split open in that sterile hospital room. It felt as if the ground itself gave way beneath me. After a lifetime of working side by side, laughing over small joys, raising children, and holding each other through storms, they were now telling me we had only months left together. Those months became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy appointments, sleepless nights, and quiet tears shed in the kitchen when no one was watching. I cooked what little he could stomach, carefully measuring medications, adjusting blankets, whispering promises I could hardly keep. Through it all, Thomas never complained. His hands, once strong and steady, trembled in mine, but his eyes still carried that same tenderness he had shown me from the beginning. During those long nights when I sat by his bed listening to the clock tick, I thought about the vows we had exchanged as two young kids who knew nothing about the weight of forever in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Now those words were no longer just ceremonial. They were my reality, and I meant every single one. When the end finally came, it was quiet. Thomas slipped away in my arms on a grey morning just days before our anniversary. The man who had been the heart of our home was gone, and I felt as though half of me had been buried with him. The funeral was held under a cold drizzle, the kind of rain that seems to mirror your grief. People came, offered condolences, and shared stories about the good man Thomas was. But what stood out to me was not the kindness of friends and neighbours. It was the performance of my son, David. He arrived in a polished black suit and dark glasses, carrying himself like the grieving son who had lost his father. To everyone else, it might have looked convincing. But I was his mother, and I knew better. Behind the solemn mask, his mind was already calculating. I could see it in the way he scanned the crowd, in the measured way he hugged me, whispering words that sounded comforting, but left a bitter taste. "Don't worry, Mum," he murmured. "I'll take care of everything from now on." At first, I wanted to believe him. In my shattered state, I wanted to think that maybe the tragedy of losing his father had woken something in him, that maybe this was his way of stepping into responsibility. But as I would soon learn, those words didn't come from compassion. They were the opening move in a plan that would change everything. Looking back, I realized that moment was the true turning point. Thomas's death left a hole in our family, and in that empty space, David's ambition and coldness rushed in. Grief should have brought us together, but instead it became the stage where betrayal would begin to play out. After Thomas passed, the silence of the farmhouse became unbearable. Every corner carried his presence: the chair where he read the newspaper, the garden where we once planted tomatoes, the bed where his laughter used to lull me to sleep. I would walk through those rooms and feel the weight of absence pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. It was in that vulnerable state that David stepped in. He came to me one evening with a concerned expression, offering what sounded like a solution. He said the farm was too lonely, too dangerous for a woman my age. "You can't stay out here by yourself, Mum. Come with me. I'll make sure you're safe." Those words, spoken so soon after burying my husband, pierced straight through my grief. I didn't have the strength to argue. Maybe a part of me even wanted to believe him. After all, what mother doesn't want to think her child is finally stepping up, finally showing care? So I agreed. I packed away the remnants of my life, my sewing machine, family photographs, little keepsakes, and left behind the home that had carried decades of memories. At first, living with David in the city felt like a temporary comfort. My grandchildren, Lucas and Emily, greeted me with hugs, asking for stories at bedtime and songs that Thomas used to hum. Their innocence was a balm on my broken heart. But behind the laughter of children, something colder began to take shape. David and his wife exchanged glances when the children clung to me. I noticed their annoyance when Lucas begged me to plant beans in small pots, or when Emily asked me to sing old lullabies. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But then came the requests. David started asking for my documents. He said it was to organize my accounts and make things easier for me. In my fragile state, still numb from grief, I didn't resist. I handed over copies of my ID, my pension paperwork, even the deed to the farm. He smiled and told me not to worry, that he would manage everything for my own good. That should have been a red flag. Looking back, I see how blind trust, born from years of sacrifice, became the very weapon used against me. It's something many of us do as parents. We assume our children, no matter their flaws, must carry at least a shred of gratitude. We convince ourselves they'll do right by us. But gratitude cannot be forced, and blind faith can become dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. Soon his tone shifted. The polite requests became commands. He began telling me I couldn't manage my own money anymore, that I shouldn't waste it on nonsense. He told me where I could sit in the living room, how I was in the way in the kitchen, even how I distracted the children with silly country habits. Every word chipped away at my dignity. The worst part wasn't the control, it was the humiliation. To be spoken to as if I were a burden in front of the very grandchildren who once looked at me with pure admiration was like swallowing shards of glass. I bit my tongue, swallowed my pride, and stayed silent. Not because I believed him, but because I refused to let the children see me fight. What I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. What started as care quickly turned into control, and control soon turned into isolation. And little by little I began to understand that my son hadn't brought me into his home to protect me. He had brought me there to take everything I had left. It didn't take long for the true nature of David's intentions to reveal itself. At first he spoke in the language of responsibility, insisting he should manage my affairs because I was getting older, and it would be easier for everyone. But soon his words carried less concern and more control. I started receiving letters from the bank envelopes I was barely able to open before David would snatch them from my hands. He dismissed them as routine, but the few I managed to glance at told a different story. Large withdrawals transactions. I had never authorized money disappearing faster than I could keep track. When I asked questions, he brushed me off. "I know what I'm doing, Mum. Trust me." But the truth was there was no trust left. He had taken my documents, and with them my independence. I had gone from a woman who had spent decades running a household, raising children, and balancing bills on pennies, to someone treated like a child who couldn't be trusted to handle a dollar. The humiliation didn't stop with money. In the kitchen, he told me I wasn't allowed to cook anymore because I made a mess. In the living room, I was told to sit in the corner so I wouldn't get in the way. Even the smallest acts of kindness, helping my grandchildren with homework, teaching them how to sew a button, were criticized as outdated and unnecessary. Imagine spending your whole life working so your children could thrive, only to be spoken to as if you were a piece of furniture taking up space. That's what it felt like I had become invisible, stripped not just of authority, but of value. One night I couldn't sleep. I wandered down the hall and overheard David on the phone. His voice was low but sharp, carrying the kind of certainty only arrogance can produce. "Everything is already in my name. Soon it will all be mine." Those words hit me harder than any insult ever could. It was confirmation of what I had feared, but hadn't dared to admit. My son hadn't invited me into his home to protect me. He had brought me there to strip me of everything I had worked for, everything Thomas and I had built together. From that moment, life in his house became unbearable. The tension was no longer hidden. It was open, suffocating. Food was kept out of my reach. Conversations cut short, my presence treated like an intrusion. Every day was another reminder that in David's eyes, I was no longer his mother. I was a burden he was desperate to unload. And then one morning at breakfast, he made his plan clear. He sat across from me, coffee in hand, and with a coldness I can still feel. He said, "Mom, you can't stay here anymore. I found a place for you in the outskirts. You'll be better off there. The words were delivered casually, like he was doing me a favor. But I knew what they meant. He wasn't offering safety. He was arranging my abandonment. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering Thomas's gentle hands, his smile that had once made every burden feel lighter. I asked myself over and over, how does a son come to this? How does blood turn against blood? I realized then that I couldn't remain silent any longer. Something inside me hardened. I had to prepare not just to survive whatever David was planning next, but to fight for the dignity he had already tried to erase. The morning he carried out his plan felt colder than any winter I can remember. David pulled the car up to the door. His voice clipped, his movements rushed. He didn't even look me in the eye. It's time, he said, as if I were baggage being delivered to a destination neither of us wanted to name. We drove for nearly 2 hours. The further we went, the more the city faded into fields, then woods, then nothing but silence broken by the hum of the engine. I tried to ask where we were going, but his answers were vague, laced with that detached tone I had come to recognize. Finally, the car slowed in front of a house that looked less like shelter and more like a tomb. The paint peeled from its walls. The windows were cracked, and the smell of dampness hit me before I even stepped outside. When he opened my door, I hesitated. Here. Are you really leaving me here? I asked, my voice trembling in a way I hated. He didn't flinch. You'll be better off here. Nobody will bother you. I can focus on my life. And just like that, he set my small suitcase on the ground, climbed back into the car, and drove away. Dust rising in the road until he disappeared completely. I stood there with my heart breaking in slow motion. The house groaned with age as if it resented my presence. Inside there was nothing but damp walls, broken windows, and an old mattress thrown on the floor. The silence was heavy, the kind that doesn't comfort but suffocates. I remember thinking so. This is what abandonment looks like, not by strangers, but by the very child I once cradled in my arms. The first days were unbearable. Food was scarce. With the few coins I had, I walked to a small village nearby to buy tortillas and beans. Nights were worse. Every creak of the roof made me wonder if it would collapse on me as I lay shivering, clutching a thin blanket. The cold seeped into my bones, and there were moments I thought death might come quietly in the night, and no one would ever know. But something inside me refused to break. Pain and fear gave way to anger, and anger gave way to resolve. I thought about the years I had stitched clothes under dim light, the calluses on my hands, the nights Thomas and I had built our life, brick by brick. I reminded myself that I wasn't useless no matter what David had said. My scars were proof of strength, not weakness. One morning, as I tried to light the small stove with trembling fingers, I looked at my hands and asked myself, how did I let it come to this? And then another thought followed. I will not let this be the end of my story. It's strange how even in the darkest places the human spirit looks for a way to rise. Each day I forced myself to get up, to walk to the village, to speak to the farmers and shopkeepers. They offered me food, sometimes a bit of work, feeding chickens, mending fences, carrying supplies. Those small acts of kindness reminded me I was still useful, still part of a world that valued effort. Abandonment could have been my grave. Instead, it became the spark that lit a fire I thought had long gone out. I promised myself that David's cruelty would not define me. If life had dragged me to the bottom, then from here, the only way was up. Little by little, I began to carve out a rhythm in that lonely, crumbling house. Each morning I forced myself to walk the dirt path to the nearby village. At first I went just to buy tortillas or beans with the few coins I had. But soon those trips became more than errands. They became lifelines. The people there noticed me a tired older woman with calloused hands and eyes still swollen from nights of fear. Instead of turning away, they welcomed me. Farmers would wave from their fields, women at the market would slip me an extra piece of bread, and children asked me where I came from. I never told them the whole truth, but in their kindness I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. One afternoon, while resting by the well, I ran into Mr. Turner, an old acquaintance from years back. He recognized me instantly. "Margaret Hale." "I thought you were still living on the farm with Thomas," he said, surprise etched on his face. I lowered my eyes, my throat tight, and simply replied, "Thomas is gone, and my son decided this was where I belonged now." He grew quiet, then placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "You don't deserve this. If you need help, you can count on me." Those words, simple as they were, lit something inside me. I wasn't as alone as I thought. The villagers found me small jobs, feeding chickens, mending fences, clearing brush. The work was humble, but it gave me food, a few coins, and more importantly, the reminder that I still had value. Every swing of the hoe, every basket carried felt like proof that I was not finished yet. But as I was rebuilding myself piece by piece, whispers began to travel through the village. Whispers about David. They said his company wasn't doing well, that debts were piling up, that deals he bragged about were falling apart. Suppliers weren't getting paid. Banks were closing their doors to him. At first, I didn't want to believe it. For so long, I had seen David as untouchable, the one who rose above the one who looked down on me with disdain. Yet here were strangers talking about his empire like a house of cards ready to collapse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same son who had stripped me of everything and left me to rot was now being dragged into the very pit he thought he had escaped. The same man who told me I was useless was learning what it meant to stand helpless before forces bigger than himself. One evening, Mr. Turner returned from the city and found me patching up a chicken coop. His face was serious. I heard more about David. The banks won't lend him another dime. He's drowning Margaret. It's only a matter of time. I nodded slowly, holding back a rush of emotions. A part of me felt a bitter satisfaction, the kind you don't want to admit, but can't deny. Another part of me grieved not for David's business, but for the boy I once knew, the child who had dreamed of more. Life has a way of leveling the scales, sometimes faster than we ever expect. And as I sat that night on the old mattress, listening to the distant sound of roosters, I felt something I hadn't felt since Thomas died. Hope. For the first time, I realized justice wasn't just an idea in stories or scripture. It was real, and it was unfolding right in front of me. The first call came one Thursday afternoon while I was at the market buying eggs. My old cell phone buzzed, and when I saw the name on the screen, my heart skipped. David. For a moment, I almost answered, but instinct told me not to. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and let it ring until it stopped. But it didn't stop. The next day, there were 3 more calls, then 10. By the end of the week, I had counted 45 missed calls, each one more desperate than the last. The voicemails started piling up. His voice cracked, frantic, shifting from begging to blaming, from sobs to threats. "Mum, please, I need your help. Mum, don't ignore me. You're the only one who can fix this. Mum, if you don't answer, I'll lose everything." Every time the phone lit up, I felt a twist in my stomach. This was the same son who had left me in a broken house like garbage, and now here he was, clawing for my attention as if his very life depended on it. I stayed silent, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had learned the hard way that not every cry deserves an answer. Sometimes silence is the only boundary strong enough to hold. but David was never one to give up easily. One Saturday morning, I heard the sound of a car crunching gravel outside the old house. Through the window, I saw him step out. His suit wrinkled dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders heavy with defeat. For a moment, I hardly recognized him. He walked up slowly, his eyes wet, and when we locked gazes, he said the words I never thought I'd hear. "Mum, forgive me." His voice cracked as he dropped to his knees right there in the dirt, clutching his hands like a child. "I was wrong. Please, teach me. Show me how to fix this. I don't know what to do anymore." It was a sight that shook me. The same son who once looked at me with contempt now knelt at my feet, pleading like a man who had lost everything. For a flicker of a second, I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees looking for comfort. But the years of betrayal weren't erased by his tears. I didn't rush to lift him up. I didn't wrap my arms around him like I might have once. Instead, I stood still, keeping a wall between us that no apology could easily break. "Get up, David," I said firmly. "A Hale doesn't crawl before anyone, not even his own mother." He obeyed, though his head hung low. "I thought I was smarter than everyone," he whispered. "I thought I didn't need anyone. But I was wrong. You've always been stronger than me. Please give me one chance." His words echoed with sincerity, but I couldn't shake the memory of the night I overheard him bragging on the phone, declaring everything was in his name, planning my downfall as if I were just an obstacle. I remembered the coldness in his voice when he told me I was a burden. Those scars don't fade easily, so I kept my distance. I pointed to a broken chair nearby. "Sit down. If you want to talk, we'll talk like adults, but don't think a few tears will make me forget." And that was the moment the balance shifted. For the first time, he needed me more than I needed him. The power he had stolen with arrogance was slipping through his fingers, and I held something he couldn't take back, my dignity. I didn't give him an answer that day. I let him stew in the silence, let him feel the weight of the consequences he had tried so hard to outrun. Because sometimes the greatest lesson isn't in what you say, it's in what you withhold. Not long after David's desperate visit, I began noticing something behind the old house. Just past the crumbling fence tucked between patches of wild grass and tangled roots was the sound of running water. At first I thought it was just a trickle from recent rain, but one morning curiosity pushed me to follow the sound. What I found stunned me. Behind that forgotten property, in a place David had written off as worthless, a crystal-clear spring bubbled from the earth. The water flowed strong, steady, and pure. I bent down, cupped my hands, and tasted it. It was cold, fresh, unlike anything from the rusty pipes I had relied on before. In that moment, standing by the spring, I felt something I hadn't in a long time possibility. The house might have been broken, but the land was alive, hiding a treasure in plain sight. It was as if the earth itself was whispering, "You are not finished yet." Word of the spring spread quickly through the village. Soon after, Mr. Coleman, a local lawyer introduced to me by a neighbour, came to visit. He listened to my story and walked the property with me, taking careful notes. After a while, he looked me in the eye and said, "Mrs. Hale, you may have more power here than you realize. Because of the way this land was abandoned, you could claim ownership through adverse possession. If you continue to live here, improve the property, and prove peaceful occupation, the law could be on your side." I was speechless. For months I had felt stripped of everything, my home, my dignity, even my sense of purpose. Now here was someone telling me that not only could I rebuild, but I could do it legally with the weight of justice behind me. A few weeks later, another visitor arrived, Dr. Mitchell, a water specialist. He came with equipment I didn't understand, testing the flow and the purity of the spring. After hours of collecting samples, he smiled. This is some of the cleanest, most abundant water I've seen in years. We're talking thousands of liters per hour. Companies would pay millions to bottle and distribute this. I nearly dropped the cup of water in my hand. Millions. The same land my son abandoned me on, the same house he called worthless, held a resource more valuable than anything he had ever built. That night I sat by the spring under the stars, listening to its steady rush. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. I thought of Thomas, of the life we had built together. And I whispered into the night, we may have lost so much, but life has a way of giving back. The irony was almost poetic. David, who had taken everything in the name of greed, was now drowning in debt. And I, the mother he called useless, was sitting on a treasure he could never have imagined. The balance was shifting, and for once, it was shifting in my favor. It was a quiet afternoon when I heard the crunch of tires outside the old house. My stomach tightened before I even saw him. David had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Two men stepped out of the truck, with him broad-shouldered, their faces hard and unreadable. David walked up, first folder in hand, his smile tight and forced. "Mum, we need to settle this today," he said. He opened the folder and held it out. "These papers will make things fair. You sign and we split the property down the middle. No arguments, no fights. I didn't even reach for it. I stood my ground, the weight of their presence pressing down on me. Half the property of what, David?" I asked calmly. "The same place you called a dump. The house you abandoned me in. Now, suddenly, it's worth so much. You want to split it?" His face darkened. The two men shifted, stepping forward as if to intimidate me. For a moment I felt the old fear rising, the same fear that had once silenced me in his home. But this time I refused to shrink back. I lifted my chin, locked my gaze on David and said, "If you think you can scare me into signing, you're mistaken. I'm 74 years old, and I've dealt with harder men than these on construction sites. Do you really believe I'll tremble now?" There was a silence so thick it felt like the world had stopped breathing. One of the men muttered, "I didn't come here to strong-arm an old woman." The other shook his head. Without another word, they turned and walked back to the truck, leaving David standing there alone, his folder limp in his hand and his dignity crumbling around him. His voice cracked with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You don't understand, Mum. This is good for both of us. If you don't sign, you're throwing away everything." I stepped closer, my voice steady but sharp as glass. "No, David. The only one this is good for is you. The only thing I want is peace. You already took my home, my money, and my trust. You will not take this too." He put his hands on his head, pacing like a caged animal. Finally, he shouted, "You can't do this to me. I'm your son. I have a right." I looked him square in the eyes. "The day you left me here, you gave up that right." For the first time, he had no reply. His mouth opened, then closed again, his anger swallowed by the silence between us. He spun around, marched to the truck, and before slamming the door, hurled one last warning. "This isn't over." The engine roared, and just like before, dust rose behind him as he sped away. But this time I didn't feel abandoned. I felt something else, a strange, steady calm. It wasn't me who should be afraid anymore. It was him. Because now, for the first time in years, I held the power. The days that followed were filled with more than just survival. For the first time in months, I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. But this time, in my favor. Mr. Coleman, the lawyer who had taken my case, visited often, carrying stacks of papers and updates that sounded more hopeful each time. "Mrs. Hale," he told me one afternoon, spreading documents across the old wooden table. "Everything is lining up. You've proven continuous occupation. You've made improvements to the land, and you've held possession without interruption. The judge is leaning in your favor. Within weeks, this property could legally be yours. I listened carefully, trying to wrap my head around the words. For so long, I had lived at the mercy of others, first David's control, then his abandonment. Now the law itself was becoming my shield. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in my head, reminding me of what he always said. Stand tall, Margaret. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed. As if that weren't enough. Another door opened. A group of businessmen came to the property with Mr. Coleman and Dr. Mitchell, the water expert. They walked the land, tested the flow again, and whispered to one another as if they had stumbled on buried gold. Finally, one of them looked at me and said plainly, "We'd like to make you an offer. This spring has commercial potential far beyond what you imagine. We're prepared to sign a contract that would guarantee you monthly royalties in the millions." Millions. The word echoed in my ears like a foreign language. For a woman who had stretched pennies to feed her children, who had worked until her hands bled on a sewing machine, it sounded almost unreal. But what mattered most to me wasn't the money. It was what the opportunity represented. Proof that the land David threw me onto, in contempt the place he called worthless, was in fact priceless. Proof that I had not been discarded by life, only redirected. But if the spring was a blessing for me, it was a nightmare for David. Word of the negotiations reached him, and his calls began again. This time, sharper, angrier, laced with urgency. He didn't talk about family or regret anymore. His mask had fallen completely. "Mum, you can't shut me out of this. That spring is ours. If you get money, I get money. Don't forget I'm your son." It was the clearest truth I had ever heard from him. Not the words, but the motive. Every plea, every tear, every performance had never been about love. It had always been about money. Standing there with the phone in my hand, I realized something life-changing. I no longer had to play along. I hung up without replying. My heart didn't ache this time. It felt steady, because now I understood beyond any doubt that David's desperation wasn't my burden anymore. The path ahead was mine to walk, and for the first time I could see where it was leading. The paperwork was moving forward. The contracts were on the table. And life, after all it had taken, was preparing to hand me back everything I had thought I lost, and more. It was late afternoon when David showed up again. But this time he wasn't driving a polished car or wearing a suit. He came on foot, his clothes plain, his face worn with exhaustion. For a moment I barely recognized him. The arrogance that once radiated from every step was gone, replaced with something that looked a lot like defeat. He stopped at the gate, hesitant, almost like a boy caught sneaking home after curfew. "Mum," he said quietly, "I don't want money. I don't want papers. I need a place to stay. Just for a while. I promise I won't cause trouble." I studied him carefully. My mind replayed the day he abandoned me here. The dust from his car still stinging my eyes. His cold words still echoing in my chest. And now here he was asking to come back under the very roof where he left me to rot. "Do you understand what you're asking, David?" I said at last. "This house, the same one you dumped me in, you now want to share with me?" He lowered his head. "I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I have nowhere else to go." A storm of feelings tore through me. The mother in me still saw her son broken and in need. But the woman who had endured his cruelty remembered every humiliation, every wound that hadn't yet healed. Finally, I nodded. "You can stay, but only under one condition. No lies, no games. If you've really come to change, you'll prove it with your actions, not your words. The next morning, I woke to find him already outside, sleeves rolled up, clearing brush behind the house. He carried buckets of water, repaired old fences, even knelt to help plant seeds in the soil. I watched from the doorway, torn between suspicion and hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't barking orders or calculating what he could take. He was working, really working like a man trying to rebuild something he had destroyed. One evening, as we sat over a simple meal of beans and bread, he finally spoke what had been weighing on him. "Mum," he said, his voice low, "I always wanted to be more than you. Not because I hated you, but because I was terrified of becoming you. I didn't want to live a life that felt small, a life where you give everything and get nothing in the end." His confession cut deep. He didn't realize that what he called small was the very life that had fed him, clothed him, given him the chance to dream. I set my fork down and looked at him. "David, you never understood," I said softly but firmly. "It's not about how much money you make or how many titles you collect. In the end, the only thing that matters is the dignity with which you live. That's what I tried to teach you all along." He nodded, eyes wet, but I could see the conflict inside him. Change doesn't come with a single apology. It takes time, effort, and choices made again and again. And that's why I made it clear. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. He could stay, but redemption wouldn't be handed to him. It would have to be earned day by day, one action at a time. It was past midnight when I heard the creak of the back door. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal nosing around the porch, but the sound was too careful, too deliberate. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped quietly into the yard. There, in the pale light of the moon, I saw him, David. He was crouched by the spring phone in hand, whispering into it while filming the water as if it were a prize he had just discovered. His voice was urgent, sly. "I'll send you the footage. We can make a deal. Don't worry. She doesn't know a thing." The sight of it made my chest tighten. After all the apologies, all the early mornings working side by side, all the talk of wanting a second chance here, he was again scheming, plotting, trying to cash in on something that wasn't his. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply stepped forward, the gravel crunching under my feet. He spun around, his face caught between shock and guilt. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The night air was heavy, the sound of the spring rushing behind him like a witness. Finally, I broke the silence. "So this is who you are after everything," he stammered, trying to explain. But I raised a hand to stop him. "No more words. You've had more chances than most men ever get. I gave you food when you left me starving. I gave you shelter when you left me in the cold. I even gave you trust after you betrayed me, and still you choose deceit." His eyes watered, but I didn't soften. Something inside me had settled. This wasn't anger anymore, it was clarity. "David, I will not let betrayal sit at my table again. Pack your things. By morning you will be gone. For good." He pleaded, but I shook my head. "You are my son by blood, but trust must be earned, and you've broken it. Beyond repair. I will not let history repeat itself. Not for me, not for the land, not for the future of this family." The next morning the house felt lighter. For the first time I wasn't bracing for another blow. I wasn't clinging to a fragile hope that he might change. I had drawn a line firm and final. As I stood by the spring watching the water sparkle in the sunlight, I realized this was more than just a victory over David. It was a declaration to myself that no matter what had been taken from me, no matter who had tried to break me, I would not be defined by betrayal. I would be defined by resilience, and this time there would be no turning back. The day of the court's decision felt like the closing of a circle. I sat in that small county courtroom, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening as the judge read the ruling. His words were steady, almost ordinary in tone, but to me they rang like a bell. The property and the spring were legally mine. For months I had lived in the shadow of loss. My husband gone, my home stolen. My dignity tested at every turn. And now, with one stroke of a pen, the law recognized what I had fought so hard to prove I belonged here. This land, this spring, this future, it was mine by right. Not long after the contracts were finalized, the company that had studied the spring signed an agreement promising royalties that would secure me more than just survival. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worrying about pennies or stretching meals or wondering how to make ends meet. I had stability. I had freedom. But it wasn't the money that filled me with gratitude. It was the justice. To know that the same ground where I had been abandoned, humiliated, and left to fade away was now the very place that gave me strength that was the real treasure. With some of the first earnings, I began restoring the house. The broken windows were replaced with sturdy glass, the roof patched so it no longer groaned in the wind. The walls, once damp and crumbling, now stood painted and warm. And at the entrance, I placed a plaque with my husband's name, Thomas Hale. Because every brick I repaired, every board I nailed, every flower I planted, it was all for him too. He had been the anchor of my life, the one who believed in me when I doubted myself. I wanted this home, once a place of pain, to carry his memory with honor. The best part came when Michael and Anna arrived with their families. They pulled into the yard, their children running ahead, laughter filling the air. For the first time in years, my house was alive with voices and warmth. My grandchildren played by the garden, chasing chickens and dipping their hands into the spring. My children sat at the table, listening to stories, offering hugs I had longed for. In those moments, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: wholeness. Life had taken me through betrayal and grief, but it had also brought me here to a place of justice, of healing, of family gathered once more. As the sun set behind the trees and the sound of laughter drifted across the land, I whispered to myself a truth I had fought hard to earn. I was not abandoned. I was not useless. I was a woman who endured, who stood back up, and who claimed her place in this world. Justice had come not with vengeance, but with renewal. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. In the months that followed the court's decision, life began to settle into a rhythm of peace I hadn't known in years. David disappeared from my world, swallowed by the consequences of his own choices. I heard whispers that his debts had caught up to him, that he was drifting from city to city, chasing quick money that never came. My heart ached for him, not with the ache of longing, but the ache of a mother who knows her child has to live with the weight of his own actions. And yet even with that sorrow, I felt stronger than ever. Because love, as I had finally learned, does not mean allowing yourself to be destroyed. Compassion doesn't mean erasing boundaries. I still carried love for the boy David once was, but I no longer gave blind forgiveness to the man he had chosen to become. The land became my anchor. The house, once broken and empty, now stood repaired, alive with family and laughter. Michael and Anna's children ran through the fields, splashing in the spring, their joy echoing against the hills. Every Sunday we gathered at the table, bowls of soup, steaming stories flowing as freely as the water behind the house. Sometimes I would pause in those moments, listening to the laughter, watching my family's faces lit by candlelight, and whisper quietly to myself, "This is justice." Not the courtroom ruling, not the contracts signed, not the money in the bank, but this, the gift of dignity restored, the gift of love without fear, And so, if my story has anything to offer, it is this: respect your parents, no matter how ordinary their lives may seem. A life of sacrifice is not meaningless. It is the foundation on which you stand. Learn your rights. Understand the law and never sign papers you don't fully understand. Too many lives are undone, not by violence, but by quiet signatures written in blind trust. Most of all believe that justice comes. It may arrive late, it may take the long road, but when it comes, it restores more than what was lost. If these words move you, share this story. Share it with your children, your neighbors, your friends. Let it be a reminder that resilience outlives betrayal, that truth outlasts deception, and that justice, though sometimes slow, always finds its way home.